This is an interview with Lady Morris, the wife of the late Senator Morris, Sir Kenneth Morris. The interview has been carried out in Cooktown and at Cairns, and today being July 4th, 1983, I met Lady Morris at Air Queensland Terminal at 8:20 this morning, and a most eventful day followed with wrong luggage, losing purses, meeting old friends, and eventually putting her on the train, the Sunlander train, at 2:30 in the afternoon. The interview follows. In your lifetime, you must have had a close association with royalty.
Well, we did actually, because Ken was in Parliament for quite some years, and the different royalty came out. The King, we didn't see him, but the Queen and Prince Philip and Princess Anne and Princess Marina, when Ken was down in Federal Parliament, and I went down there, and Princess Marina, beautiful woman she was, and different other people that came through connected with royalty, and Queen Mum, of course, she was marvellous. We had an opening for centenary year, and the ladies that had the organisation of a certain thing for the opening, that was the centenary committee. We had the City Hall, and I said to the police inspector, will you see that there's quite a few policemen here when we have our meeting? He said, yes, I'll arrange for a couple. And I said, you'll need more than a couple. I said, we're going to fill the City Hall. No, he said, you couldn't possibly fill the City Hall. And I said, well, we are. Will you see that there's enough policemen? And he said, yes. So he didn't. He did what he was going to do and had a couple of policemen, and the City Hall filled, and they were standing round the walls, and they were upstairs, and they were on through all the passages, and he had to get a whole lot of policemen, before all of those people came. And there were things like that we had a lovely time. There's lots of memories. Well, this opening was very good, and I had to make a speech of welcome, and I was terrified. So anyhow, I had a sort of a scroll and did it all, very theatrically, and did my little piece first before the rest of the program went through. The hall was full and everybody went off very well. But before that, I had said to the head of the Church of England, he's now over in England, will you please not have your service, your weekday service, on a Thursday, because we're having this women's meeting in the City Hall. And he said, who's running it, and who's a minister? And I said, we're not having a minister. This is a service, but we're not having a minister. And he said, well, who's running it? And I said, I will be in charge. And he said, the High Priestess, Mrs. Morris. And I said, so, but it went off very well. Mr. Macpherson was the secretary, the ministers, the secretary, and he said that there was no way in the world, this was only ladies, and there was no way in the world he was going to be kept away. So he was the only man there, and he did his piece very nicely and keeping out of sight, although he was there. That was a very good thing, because that opened centenary year. As far as the women of Queensland were concerned, we had them from all over the place. And then we just filled up with all sorts of things after that. Another special one I liked was when Princess Alexandra was coming out, and we decided we'd have floral footpaths and get all the organisations to have a little space and do a floral something or other, and which we did, and that was lovely. And that was on, when you go to the gardens, there's the Parliament House and there's the gardens on the other side, and it was on the 2 footpaths in that area. And it was such a shame that it couldn't be left for other people to see, for more people to see. But it had to be cleared because the footpaths had to be walked on that late that afternoon. But things like that was, you can go back and you can think about that, and that brings to mind also the number of people that you can think about, because I had some marvellous people. I was president of that committee, and I had some marvellous people on the committee there. And we had as our treasurer a Jewess, and they thought that was a very, stroke of genius, having poor old Elsie on. We did very well. We made a lot of money, and presented it to the Croatian Kindergarten Association for another building. And what else now can I talk about? When Ken was down in Parliament in Canberra, we used to go down sometimes and listen to the thing. Terrible.
No, I can always dub it.
Can you?
Mm.
Ah.
But we haven't got onto the policeman on the motorbike either.
Where was the policeman on that boat?
When the princess wanted to go to the toilet.
Oh, well, I only told you about that.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, we had this, at this ladies' meeting, the women's meeting in the festival hall. It was, poor thing, she'd been up at the library and she had to go from there to us, and then she had to go out to the exhibition after that. So this man on the motorbike, it was one of the soldiers, I think, and he came herring down on a motorbike and said, will you please have the toilet ready? The princess would like to go to the toilet when she gets down there. So one of the girls dashed up and tidied up the toilet and came dashing down again just as princess arrived. And so I took her through Bert Potts' office. He was the manager of the festival hall. And just outside a door, which was only against a wall, and she had to go straight in. There was really, I doubt whether anybody in the hall, or very few people, could have seen her. But the very fact that she had to enter that hall that way was quite against the rules. So the poor thing, she didn't go up to the toilet. So she came back and she entered the right way through the main door and right down to where we had the seating for her. And there was the Junior Eisteddfod Choir, which had won prizes all over Australia, and they were up on the platform. And then we had representatives of all the organisations, one representative of all the organisations up on the platform behind the choir. And we had been told that the princess would not be going up onto the platform. So I thought, oh crikey, I must do something about this. And so I kept on talking to her about it and telling her how marvellous the conductor was and what a marvellous choir it was and how many times they'd won Eisteddfods in different places. And she said, I should like to go up and see them. And the aide-de-camp at the back said no. And she said, yes, I would like to go up and see them. And so he said no, but that made no difference. So I took Princess up onto the platform.
This is Princess Alexandra.
This is Princess Alexandra, yes. And I took her up onto the platform, and she talked to the children and to a couple of the others and that were there. And then she came down, and he was very annoyed. I forget his name, but he used to come out with Princess Marina too. Now, Princess Marina was a lovely person, and she was sweet. It was so sorry she had to die the way she did, wasn't it? Anyhow, this all went off very well, and Princess Alexandra then went out to the exhibition. But to think that she was controlled on a little private thing like wanting to go to the toilet, I thought was a bit grim, and that's the sort of thing I suppose she had to put up with all the time and got used to. What else did we do for her? They had a ball at the City Hall. That was very nice. And another one at Cloudland, and they brought the koala bears. They had the whole area up there made up in like a bush, and they had the koala bears in it. And she was, talking to them and stroking them. And that was a very nice time too. Now, I had rather a grim time then, because I have had a very bad back ever since I fell in the high jump at high school, and I've never been able to do with my back what I'd like to do, and therefore I could never dance properly. Well, we were with the Government House party, and so of course Sir Henry Abel Smith says to me, and I said, well, look, I'm no good at dancing, and he said, well, I can hold you. It was the worst moment of my life. There was all the gallery full and everybody else, you know, and because he was dancing with me, because he was going to dance, nobody else got up for the first and it was terrible. Anyhow, he must have felt it was as bad as I knew it was, because he just took me round once and put me back on the form. But it was,
how would you entertain royalty in Cooktown?
Oh, we did, yes. Did we?
Yes.
No, actually, they didn't come out to our place. They arrived in Cooktown, and I was to look after Princess Anne, and so we were up at the museum, and we didn't see all what was going on. Very interesting things that were going on down where the Duke and the Princess and the Queen got off from the boat ship. Princess Anne wanted to know when she got up there and looked at it, whose house was that before it was a museum? And I was very shocked, because I thought, you know, a mum would never make a mistake like that. A mum would look after it and find out all the particulars first. But she said, whose house was it? Well, I had told her, of course, it was the convent and all that had been done to it all the rest of the time. But she wasn't a very happy girl when she was out there that time. But she looks much better now, I think. But she was very unhappy. She didn't want to come in the first place.
Tell me about the highlights of your life. Is it meeting royalty?
Was what?
Was it meeting the royalty?
Oh, well, yes, it was, because there were so many of them we met. But there was also the time when Ken got his decorations. I thought that was, because I always thought that Ken should have had something. Nobody else probably did, but I knew what he had done and how much he'd done and how much time he spent at home, which was very little. And I was quite happy with it. And then the second one, of course, it was lovely. He got the CMG first, and then he got the KBE. And the CMG was when we were in Brisbane, and the KBE was after we'd gone to Cooktown. And so, you know, that was quite a highlight up there. And I felt that was a highlight, because it was earned. I suppose lots of wives think the same thing about their husbands. The other one was, I think, all the opportunities I had of meeting royalty, and also, believe it or not, wasn't a highlight, but it gave me an insight into human nature, because when Queen Mum was out, there was a dinner for her, and we were upstairs, just the group of parliamentarians, and the table was set and we were supposed to have dinner, so it went on it was late and we hadn't had anything to eat because we were going to have dinner. And Queen Mum just sort of had a sip of tea and a nibble of something and rose. So we all had to too, and go downstairs, and they had this large marquee on the lawns of Parliament House, and everybody was down there was having a whale of a time, and they had trees, banana trees and all sorts of things, made it all look very nice, but you never saw so many bottles of whiskey hidden in amongst the banana trees and all these things, I suppose to take home later on. But we didn't see very much of Queen Mum then, because she moved around, and we ducked up after she'd gone. We ducked upstairs, but everything had been cleared away, so we didn't have anything to eat that night. And this happened quite often. And there used to be times when I thought I'd have a day at home. This is not a highlight, but I suppose you could call it, in a way. It highlighted the way I had to carry on sometimes. And I was home. I had the day to myself that day, no things to do outside. And a ring came from Cedric Johnston, who was Ken's secretary, and said, "Will you please be ready? The car is on its way. Mr. Nicklin, Mrs. Nicklin, they can't get away from Parliament House because Queen Mum is still talking to him. And so you will have to go out and be there to receive the Governor and his wife when they come." And because they had to leave before the others. And so out I fell into my clothes and did my face up in the car as we were going along, and then I picked up Ken on the way, and we hooted along and got down near where the railway line crosses down on the way to the airport. And it's a V. You can go, there are two streets and you can go one street or the other. Well, we'd gone the other and we couldn't get through. So Pat, the driver, turned round and went across the tramway, had their repair place there, and they had this great big grease trap, and it went down to China. You know, you couldn't see where it finished down there, and he got the wheels of the car just on the thing, and we got across safe and got onto the other side, and he saw a policeman. Well, the police all knew the cars, and so he just waved his finger and the policeman let us get through, and we got there and only just had our feet out of the car onto solid ground when the others were behind us, so we only just made it. So there were things like that all the time that happened. And what else was there that happened?
Tell me about your life in the Cooktown area. Have you been to the tip of Cape York?
No.
Have you travelled throughout the peninsula at all?
No, I hadn't gone. I'd been up to Weipa and Cohen, but I hadn't gone way up. Ken had been up, of course, and Ken was up at Thursday Island once. This has got nothing to do with of my experience, except that I made a fool of myself. Ken was up at Thursday Island, and in Brisbane, there was something that had been in the papers, and I took exception to it, and I thought this was quite wrong, and I wrote a long letter, and I was very friendly with Pat Toms, who was a very good Courier Mail reporter, and she would never print anything unless she asked me whether I think it was all right. And I wrote this long screed. I put all my feelings on paper and gave it to Pat. And she said, I'm going to print it. And I said, you can't do that. And she said, yes, I am. Do you believe it? And I said, yes. Well, she said, if you believe it, I'm going to print it. I said, you can't print all of that. However, she printed quite a lot of it. And Ken was up in Thursday Island, and he gets on the plane. And he sees this thing about his wife, you know, sort of saying this, that and something else. When he got back to Parliament, Jack Duggan never gave him any peace. Every time he'd get up to talk, Jack Duggan would say, have you asked your wife if that's all right? Does she agree with that? You know, so that sort of thing went on with him too. But I suppose there were miles of things. When the Queen and Princess and the Duke, when they were up there, we had a party out at Parliament, out at Rosebank, our place. The reason being, the secretary in Brisbane had rung up and he'd said to me, do you know of an area in Cooktown that's big enough to hold a party for all the people that have come from all over to see the Queen, and we're going to have this party afterwards? And I said, are you asking if you can have our place? And he said yes, because we had a big area and a lawn and all the rest of it at Rosebank. And so I said, well, that's all right. So after everything, all of these, Bishop of Carpentaria and goodness knows what all, they were all there, and they all came out after, and they just sort of had their nibbles and their drinks out on the lawn. And that was an enormous crowd that came there, and that was interesting, because that was shot at, put on your plate without any anticipation of what was going to happen. And things like that cropped up all the time, I suppose, really.
Now, your children, how many children did you have?
I had 5. I had Grant and Barbara and Bill, and unfortunately Bill died of a brain tumour while Ken was away at the war. That was a very hard time, that was, and he was only 4 when he had his operation on the brain. We had to go down to Sydney for that. And then I had a break of 10 years, because what with the war and what with me having a nervous breakdown, and we didn't do anything with regard to having any further family until 10 years after the others. And then I had 2 boys, David and Bruce.
Now, Grant's in Cooktown.
Grant and Bruce are both in Cooktown. Grant's the eldest, Bruce is the youngest. And Bruce and Margaret, his wife, they took over Rosebank, where we lived. When we came to Brisbane, they took it over and ran the dairy. Ken opened a dairy. Ken started a dairy in Cooktown because the poor people of Cooktown had to have fresh milk, he said. And so he started the dairy. And I used to drive this Ford 100 and push the cans around, the 6 or 8 gallons, whatever they were, and it's no wonder I got thinner and thinner and looked like a ghost. Pat Hannis used to get awfully annoyed with me. Anyhow, we delivered the milk into town, And then later on, my friend came up for a holiday and she stayed for 6 months and did the same thing. She helped because Brucey was in camp, and she helped them with the milking and did the deliveries. And then it would rain. It was in the rainy season, and you'd get stuck in the wheels. The car was going all right, but it was standing still and just churning its wheel, you know, the wheels churning everything up. Fortunately, the army was there, and they were settled in the airport. And when the water came up with so much rain, the water came right up into their kitchen. And but anyhow, we sometimes would get stuck and couldn't get through. The army was getting milk from us. And so they knew if we weren't there at 10:30, they'd come along with their thingamies and pull us out. And this was the sort of thing that happened all the time in the wet season up there. And we couldn't get across sometimes. The water was too high over the bridge.
Did any of your children marry Cooktown people?
No, Brucey was a bit the closest. Bruce met his wife, she was a nurse at the Holy Spirit Hospital in Brisbane, and Bruce was in camp. And some of the boys were friendly with the Holy Spirit nurses, and they took Bruce along one night, and he met Margaret there. And that went on into the longest little course, and they got married, and now they've got 4 children.
And Margaret came from where?
Margaret's people were in Darwin. They still now in Darwin, and they were living in other places, and I don't know all the places that they were in before. Margaret's sister is a doctor. She is also a nun, and she is over in Bangladesh and has been there for years. Margaret is very much like her sister in the caring for people, you know. And she's a very good worker. Then Grant is 4 miles. That's Brucey's wife, or Bruce is our youngest. And then David, the next one, he is in government down in Canberra. By that I mean he works for the government down in Canberra. Oh no, recently he's moved to Melbourne, and the job is connected with but not controlled by the government. And then Grant is the eldest, and he's had this place at Hazelmere up in Cooktown since before we went up. Grant went up. We took Grant up, and he settled in a little cottage and cleared 100 acres, and that's how he started over there. And he likes it. Narelle, I think, is more of a town person. I think Narelle would like to go to town.
Where's she from?
Brisbane. She's Rainworth. She came from Brisbane in the first instance, and she's very unlike. I mean, Grant's not a person who wants to be out all the time. Narelle is, but she's pulled Grant out of his shell a bit. So they've got on very well down there. They're 4 miles separating them and Brucey.
Where were you born?
I was born in Mareeba, 1909. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. What was your maiden name?
I was a Dunlop. My mother was married to William Dunlop, and he lived in Mareeba too. She taught school teaching in Mareeba. They were married in Mareeba. I was born in Mareeba, and we left there when I was a few months or 1 or something.
Well, Mareeba has a hotel called the Dunlop Hotel.
That's right. My father's brothers started that hotel, and I don't think there's any of them in it now. It's still called the Dunlop's Hotel, but I don't think there's anybody in it.
That's an interesting book.
Yes, well, we wanted to raise money, the Ladies' Auxiliary, and so I suggested that we do a recipe book. That was one of the first things we ever raised money with, apart from little evening functions now and again. And we sold thousands of those. We did 1,000 of this, and then we had a repeat of 1,000 from the printers. And now, the ones that are there now, they're a sort of condensed one. They're not the same as this. And they've cut out quite a lot of it and just have the recipes, some of the recipes.
Tell me about the variety of the recipes and where they came from.
Well, I thought it'd be a very good idea if we started right off, and I've got right back to how to make infused tea, way back before they ever knew anything about tea, and then the different way you had to cook the foods, how they did sucking pigs and calf's feet jelly and sheep's head and things like that. And then also telling them about the different measurements. The measurements now are not the same as the measurements then are not the same as we have now. And going right through and then coming on to the modern part. But I knew a fellow in one of the government departments, and he used to go out with shooting, and so he gave me some recipes for kangaroo and wallaby and pigeons and things like that. So that's in too. And then some of the old, very old ones, and the type of things they had in the old days. If you went on a picnic, what we do now, we put in a few stubbies and things, but here they have 4 loaves of bread, and they've got all sorts of bottles of fruit and so on. It's entirely different.
How far back would those recipes date?
Oh, this was right in the beginning of Cooktown. Way back. This was some of the things that they did have in the beginning of Cooktown. And then over the way they used to do their washing, and somebody who'd bought one of these books and his daughters wanted to have a look at it, and they said, what a silly thing. Why did they have to go to all that trouble? Why couldn't they just sort of put a little bit of the same as we do now? And of course there wasn't anything like it. They just couldn't realise how long ago this was all done. All these funny sorts of washing and the way they had to cook and so on. Well, then we go right through the book into the modern part, and I worked out then the different fruit that's up here, and got recipes of all the different fruits, the grapefruit and even, the whole lot, lemons and or different oranges and pineapples and so on.
We've got some exotic fruits here too, I'd imagine.
Oh, I reckon there's a few of them here, but I can't just think what they are right all. But I like recipes. I like cooking, and so it didn't worry me. But I did all this, and Ken used to check it over with me in case we'd made mistakes, and we got through it quite well, really, and it was a very good money spinner.
Those pigeons you're talking about, would they be the Torres Strait pigeon they could?
Well, they weren't supposed to use them, but they did. The Aboriginals used them a lot. They still do, I think. Yeah, and the kangaroos. Squab pigeons, it's called here. And the wallaby mince, and then there's another stewed pigeons, braised cockatoo, baked galah and roast quail. Quite a variety.
And how much money did you raise with that?
Oh, I can't remember, but we raised a terrific amount. We had, in the first batch that the printers did, there was a slight error here and there. When I checked it, it didn't really matter, I suppose, but I just said, she said, OK, you can have those, that 1,000. So we sold that 1,000 while they were printing the other lot. I forget how many reprints we had, but it was very good. We sold them for $1. On the front is our picture of old Cooktown. And then Sir Raphael had a piece in the beginning, and then I had a piece, and that was that.
The committee of the day, when the convent was transformed from that old building into the museum it is today, it must have had a fair amount of problems in the transition period.
Yes, you mean when it was actually being in a museum, being turned into the museum. Well, we didn't have the problems with the making that wreck into a building that could be a museum. That was done by professional people. But we had quite a problem in we were trying to collect extra things. If you remember, there was a little old museum. They used to have it in the school, and then they had it in the hall in the street, the old railway station. And from there, it went into the museum. Well, in the beginning, when it was in the hall in the old railway station, it was a bit of a hodgepodge. And then we got it a bit tidy, and it was all ready to go up. You had to put a lot of stuff out because it was interesting to the people who gave it to you, but it wasn't going to be interesting to the people who'd come and see it, really. But I think it was marvellous. I loved every minute of it. And the girls were good. I had a marvellous committee.
When you say that wreck, it was very dilapidated, wasn't it?
It was terrible. I understand, I wasn't here when all this happened, but I understand up until the time of the war, the soldiers were in it, and then after that there were university students that could come and they were in it, and then some vandals got in and took things. There was lots of the iron lace around the balconies that was taken from by different people, and the cedar railings and things, and all of that had to be redone. And then it really was in a mess, and Sir Raphael got the idea that it would make a lovely museum, and he convinced the Bishop Torpey of that, which we were very lucky, really, because it was on the point of having the auctioneer's hammer come down and being sold, you know. And Sir Raphael, he sort of put it across very well, and so Bishop Torpey said, OK, providing you bring it back to its original state. And I think that it has been brought back to its original state, except the attic. Nothing was done to that.
Bishop Torpey's a remarkable person.
Yes, yes. I think he cares a great deal, you know, for people's ideas.
In the restoration of that building, there is a story pertaining to Captain Cook's cannon, the cannon of the Endeavour, being sent here to be installed in there for a given period and then taken away. But I understand today that it can't be taken away because it can't be got out. Can you elaborate on that?
No, I don't know that. I heard it here and there, but I didn't know whether it was a nice little story or whether it was authentic. I think that if they moved just part of the side panels of the door, they could get the canal out, but there's no way in the world they're going to get the anchor out, because this anchor this is the real anchor, the last one that they dug up out of the sea, and it is to go the rounds, and supposed to be 2 years at each place. But it's tremendous. I mean, weighs tons, and it's very wide. And have you seen it yourself up there in the museum?
It's been there all the time, has it?
No, it's only been here a couple of years.
Oh, well, I haven't.
You haven't seen it? Yes, well, the Ladies' Auxiliary sort of paid for the glass walls. There were a lot of rules went with having this cannon, and
The anchor.
eh?
You were talking about the anchor.
Oh, I'm sorry, about the anchor, yes. There were a lot of rules that went with having that, and it had to be air-conditioned. Well, you had to get an enormous air conditioner to go underneath the building to air-condition this large glass wall so people could see it. And so the Ladies' Auxiliary paid for most of that too. That was because we'd always having functions, and we were always well patronised, and we had a little bit of surplus and still have. So if anything's wanted at the museum that they can't afford, or the trust in Brisbane doesn't think we should have, we have our own money, we can do it ourselves.
How did they get the anchor into the building?
Well, I wasn't here when that happened, but I understand. You know how it is. There's glass panels on each side of the door, and I understand they had to take all of that down, and even perhaps a bit more, but they couldn't go very far because the rest of it was all brick.
Yeah.
But it's a tremendous anchor.
Yeah. Now, Lady Morris, you and Sir Kenneth came to Cooktown in the 1950s. What brought you here?
Ken did. He was very keen on coming up to Cooktown. I thought it was the last place on earth that I ever wanted to see. I was in my late 50s, and was leaving all my friends behind, you know, and coming up to Cooktown seemed a terrible thing. But when I got here, we lived in gauze and canvas huts because there was nothing we wanted to build later on, and I was terrified. However, I got to like it. It didn't take me long to get to like it. But I have some very interesting photos of me doing the washing in an oil drum out in a long grass, you know, and all sorts of things like that, which I never thought I'd be doing anymore.
Where exactly were you then? The location of your farm?
Well, where the dairy, and then there's the house in the you know, and where the huts were just this side of the dairy, where the tank stand is.
But where? Where in
Cooktown.
In the town itself?
Oh, no, out here on the farm. How much? About 12, 14 something miles out of town. Mm.
Past the aerodrome?
Oh, yes, the aerodrome's halfway.
Right,
Mm.
yeah.
And
Yes. At that time, Sir Kenneth was still leader of the Liberal Party, State Liberal Party, and travelling off to Brisbane to Parliament.
He came up, he wasn't very well, and he got out of state politics and came up here. And he was living in these little gauze and canvas things with his old batman, at one stage, old snoz we used to call him. They were sort of trying to get things a little bit organised. Then I came up later on when things were a little bit organised, and we separated the huts. The huts were 8 by 8, and they were gauze walls, and they had a canvas roof like the Japanese pagodas, and you could put up a wooden, you know how you'd put a stick in to hold windows up in the good old days? Well, you could do that with the wooden base, a 3-ply base, and then you could roll the canvas on the top. Well, I thought it was going to be terrible there, but I got used to it and I liked it very much in the beginning. But we separated. Ken used to live in just one of them, and when I was coming up, he thought he'd better do something about it. So he separated one hut, 8 foot, 8 foot, and an 8 foot space in the middle, with just a gauze wall, and that was the kitchen. And it was lovely. You could see all the snakes crawling around underneath. And
You didn't like snakes?
I was terrified of snakes. When we were coming up, a friend of mine came up with me first to have a look at this awful place I was going to live in. And we called in at Port Douglas. I said, if I'm going to live up there among snakes, I want to know what a taipan looks like. If he's going to look me in the eye, I want to know just how hard I have to run. And so we called in at Port Douglas. Was it Port Douglas? No. Do you know where the snake thing is out there? Just outside Cairns, isn't it? Yes. Well, we went there.
Hartley's Creek.
That's right. And I said to the chappie, he said, you know, what is it you want? You want to look around? And I said, yes, well, what I really want to know is how can I tell the difference between a taipan and any other snake, because I want to know how hard I have to run, you see. And he said, oh, there's no difference at all. And my friend had said, well, her boys told her that ordinary snakes, I might be getting this a bit mixed up, ordinary snakes have 2 anal scales and a taipan only has 1. Is that right? And he said, yes. And so he said, I'll take you outside and show you them. Well, he only showed us a little one, you know, a baby, little thin one. And I was expecting to see these great big serpent-looking things. And but I did see them actually when I was used to go around in the paddocks with Grant and look after Alan. We were sitting in the truck and this enormous thing went past. And we had 5 acres, a paddock of 5 acres at Rosebank. We used to call that our snake country. Because once when George was harvesting the whatever it was they had in there at that time, he harvested 5 taipans in that very small area. And then we had a ring from the university once to see if one of the Indonesian boys or somebody from the islands could come up. He was doing theses about different things, and he wanted to know about legumes and something else. And so we said yes. Well, the poor fellow, he came one day and Ken took him out that afternoon and showed him how to bring the cows in. And the next morning he went out and he didn't come back. And so Ken went looking for him and couldn't find him. And he said, I never knew a man and cows could disappear into thin air. He couldn't find any of them. So then we went out again, and there was a very slight movement on the bed of the creek, just down the bank a bit, and there was the fellow there, and he'd been bitten by a snake, and he was lying there, fatalism of the East. He was just lying there waiting to die. He didn't even try to get out, and it was only a little rise, and there was the road. So Ken picked him up, held him onto the back of the tractor and drove the tractor home, and we rang the phones were out of order. And we tried to get through and couldn't, and eventually got buzz, to Cooktowners, and they came up. And he was taken into hospital, and he was pretty well, out to it by that. Well, he was out to it by that time, but they didn't think he'd live, so they shot him down to Cairns. And for 10 days, some of our men from up in Cooktown were in the hospital, and they said it was really terrible to see him trying to breathe. His rib case had come up and then it had just collapsed, and the poor fellow, he only had 1 day there, and we had to pack up all his things and send them down. So I hope he got on all right since.
Hey, you built a new home on your dairy farm?
Yes. When we were in Brisbane, we made our own plan for Brookfield, and so we made the own plan for here. And as you know, it's just a long, just one room after another. And we worked all of that out. And I wanted a balcony, a little gallery rather, a gallery. And everybody thought I was mad. And I tried to say, well, look, it'll be lovely, because we got some steel lace from one of the hotels. Ken bought one of the little old hotels in town that were going to be demolished, and he brought the timber home, and we used it around the place. And they had a bit of cedar, so I used the newel post, and I used a bit of cedar for the top, and the steel lace I used, and that's the gallery. And it looked very nice, but nobody could vision it. But I knew what it was going to look like.
The CSIRO carried out an experiment there, didn't they, for air conditioning?
Yes, I don't quite know what was their reason for the experiment, just what they were trying to find out. But we had a very long room. The lounge, the dining room, the kitchen all flowed into each other, and there was just a sort of a glass divider a little bit in the kitchen. And then you looked through to another place, which was a laundry, which I had to keep tidy. And then the pantry was off that. So it was just this very long space, and they thought it was an ideal way to work on an air conditioning for that type of thing. So what we wouldn't have done was to build a sort of a tunnel so that on the roof, to make it into a tunnel so that the thing could go through, and then they had the grids in different sections. And the motor was under the house.
But it was pumping water, was it? Over rock?
Yes, underneath the building, underneath the house. It didn't make... Some people said they made a sort of a square area, and they had it with the pebbles. We went down to what's the bay? Quarantine Bay. We went down to Quarantine Bay. I went with them, and we were picking up pebbles, getting the right sort of pebbles. That's what they were after. It had to be more uniform size. And so we went down there and got all the pebbles and things for it. And then they had this large square thing, and they did whatever they had to do there. And the water was going through that. It wasn't going through upstairs, and was going through that. Sometimes I thought it might have made it a little bit moist, but, a bit hot, but it was very nice. I mean, it really was. And didn't make the top look awkward or anything.
And in those days there wasn't much offering in air conditioning?
No, not up there anyhow. I mean, I think you would have only had to have the ordinary little ones that they have now.
And is it still operating?
I don't think so. I haven't been there for a long, long time. Bruce and Margaret and their kiddies are there in the house, and I don't know. I don't think it's operative.
And is the only one that's tight, to your knowledge?
I don't know whether they went any further with it. It was an experiment. I don't know whether they went any further with it. They could, or I knew they had one up in further north somewhere, trying it out up there, way up.
Was Sir Kenneth ever involved with obtaining Taipan serum?
Obtaining what?
Taipan serum.
No. We have Charles Tanner is here, and Charles Tanner came up from Melbourne. He is a very knowledgeable man with regard to snakes and all the serums and all the rest of it. And he had, I was glad I wasn't his wife, because she used to, her bedroom, the snakes were all around the bedroom, you know. I couldn't bear that. But he was a very highly recognised man in Melbourne, and he comes up here and he gets the snakes and milks them for their serum and sends it down to the laboratories. Well, our David, I had 2 families, 3 children, a break of 10 years and 2 more. Well, David is the second family, and he was very interested in snakes too. He could see them when none of us could, and he had an affinity with them, and he was always picking up snakes and taking them down to Charlie and taipans and things like that. You know, one biggish taipan, and then little ones and different other snakes. And so.
And was Charles Tanner a neighbour?
He was about. Oh yes, he was a neighbour, but a country type of neighbour in distance. You know, he was about maybe a mile away.
You had some affection for an old man crocodile.
I was terrified of that too. And I heard Willie Holsapple told me that we had a deep hole behind our place. And did you know? And I said no. And he said, well, there's an old man crocodile down there. And so I was terrified. One night I heard this funny noise, and I thought, that's funny. I didn't know there was a dog as close as that. And so the next day, just for something to talk about, I suppose, I asked Willie Holsapple what sort of a noise did a crocodile make. I said, last night I heard something that was like the cut-off bark of a dog. He said, yes, it does that. But he said in the mating season it's like the cut-off roar in a bull. Well, I said, I hope I don't sort of hear that. But I only heard it the once, and it definitely was that cut-off. It was not anything else. Another time I thought I heard a cat. And I went outside. I picked up the milk and put a saucer and took it out. And I said, puss, puss. And the cat got further away. And it was a cat bird, you know. The further I walked with this glass of milk, the further away the meowing got. It was so real. I swore it was a cat. So the same thing with anything else.
Now, when your husband died, you were residing in this area?
No. Ken was always a bronchial person, and the desert didn't do him any good. The Brook time of his desert didn't do him any good, and his breathing got worse, and we left Cooktown and went down to Brisbane, and it kept on getting worse down there with the emphysema. So, what you asked me?
About where you were residing when your husband died?
Yes, so we went down to Brisbane, and how long were we there? We ran away. We were in the Sunlander, and there was a cyclone coming, and that Sunlander was racing the cyclone to sort of get to Brisbane before it hit. You know, didn't want to get caught up in it. So it was a very nice, quick trip we had down, and we went into a unit, and Ken then had to go over to the hospital at the end. He was home, and it was very bad, his emphysema. It was very bad. And he was only in hospital a couple of days when it just got him.
And is there anything here that you could look at and say, well, that wouldn't have been here if it wasn't for my husband? Is there anything like that around the place?
Well, Rosebank wouldn't have been there if it hadn't have been for Ken. Rosebank belonged to the Waters in the first place, you know, and there's part of their place still there. Not now, because it's been sold with the other part. But there was, and I used to go down and see that. No, I don't know, except that, well, he just came out and started the legumes. I mean, you've got your legumes, of course. Ken was very interested in that, the CSIRO. He'd had lots of talks with them about it, and there wouldn't have been legumes here. The Saratro was one of them, and people liked the flowers, and that's the reason you find so much Saratro all over the place. It grows like mad, and they'd take them home, and the blessed things all over Cooktown now. But it's a very good legume. It's good for the soil.
And did he create that legume?
No. He was the manager of CSIRO in Brisbane was very keen on legumes. In a way, I think that up north, further north, where they didn't have food for cattle all the time and that was a good thing, because there were other legumes as well. But the Saratro roots, I used to say, go down to China. You can hardly sort of get the roots out. And it's always able to be used. Even if it's snipped right down, it'll come again, because the roots are good. So you've got that good legume all the time.
And it will grow in very wet areas?
Or grow anywhere.
Will it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that'll just seem to grow anywhere.
Would you say there was any marked change in your lifestyle when you became a Lady Morris?
No. I used to get very, very annoyed, because people would say something and I'd say, I'm still plain Ettie Morris. I haven't changed from what Ettie Morris was yesterday to what she is now. I didn't feel there was any difference. I didn't think I put on any airs and graces.
Did you find that there were any demands made on you with a title that you wouldn't?
Oh yes, there was a lot of that. Particularly with Ken in Parliament, because I was tied up with that too. I'd get a message, or I'd know what my plans were for the day, and I knew that I had to be ready by a certain time. And I'd get a message: the car will be out for you in 10 minutes, and you have to be ready. We have to go out to the airport because Frank Nicklin is held up at Government House and can't get out to the airport to greet whoever it was that was there when they arrived at the airport. So we had to go. And I quite often did my face up in the car, but did up a last lot of buttons or something like that.
Were you quick at it normally?
Was I quick at it?
Yes, your makeup.
Yes.
But normally, were you quick at it, before this? Or did you take a long time?
No, I never fussed much about my face. I should have, and wouldn't have frightened people so much now, but I mean, no, I never worried very much about it. I mean, even when I was up here in the sun, I never put on all this stuff to keep the sun off. I was staggering around carrying rocks to make a rockery and all sorts of things. And I didn't care for my skin. I'm very sorry for you.
How much affection have you for Cooktown now?
I like Cooktown very much. I love coming up. I come up every year. I liked living here. I really did when I got over the shock of having to leave Brisbane. When I knew I had to leave Brookfield, I just sat down in the middle of the lounge floor and howled, an empty house, everything had gone. But I liked Cooktown, and I still do.